If you know the rules and styles of poetry, and have got the hang of them, then suddenly you feel inspired to write poetry. Where does this lead us? To creating something. But if you don't know any of the rules or forms, and you claim to have poetic inspiration, you're really at a loss for how to write. Faced with so many possibilities, what would your artistic training produce? It means you would have learned a lot about poetry, about how to write poetry. What does that mean? It means you've learned many different styles, like regulated verse, 5-character regular verse, quatrains, 7-character regular verse, and so on. The more of these styles you've mastered, the better and more complete your understanding, and the easier it is to find the right approach for your creation. Is the poetic inspiration in your heart best expressed in 7-character regulated verse or 5-character regular verse, in 7 characters or 5 characters? It's not just a random choice. You quickly realize that the poetic inspiration you want to express can only fit into 7 characters, and won't work in 5 characters, or it can only be a quatrain, just 4 lines, not 8. We shouldn't think that we have the freedom to choose however we want. If you say you can write a poem both in 7 or 5-character regulated verse, it shows a lack of understanding of poetry. When we compare 7 and 5-character regulated verse, the emotions and imagery they convey, and the possible development of the imagery, are quite different. For example, try extending Wang Wei's 5-character regulated verse a little. Try writing it in 7 characters. You might be able to do it, but the artistic concept is already different, completely different. The converse is true, the essence of the 5-character regulated verse is lost, and what was originally in the 7 characters disappears. So, the dream of the Red Chamber is really cool. It shows how well-read Chao Shuoqin was in literary theory. He's all about Jia Baoyu. Jia Baoyu is a real whiz at poetry. One time, his dad, Jia Zheng, was shooting the breeze with some guests and brought up this story about a lady general from history. This lady general stepped up and fought during a bandit uprising and, well, she died. Isn't that a story just begging to be turned into a poem? So, he gathered his 3 kids. One is his son, Jia Baoyu, right? Then there's Jia Baoyu's bro, Jia Huan, and Jia Zheng's grandson, Jia Lan. All 3 of them can write poetry. They got together and were told to write a poem based on this historical story. So, Jia Lan wrote a 5-line poem, and Jia Huan also wrote a 5-line poem. Now it's Baoyu's turn. Baoyu first said something. He said that such a story can't be written in a strict form. What should be used? Old-style poetry. A long poem or a poem in a song form, to really bring out what? The emotions and vivid details. After some back and forth, with each sentence of this discussion, the guests on the side cheered. After all, he's a pro at poetry, saying this is like a tailor measuring a person's body first, right? Then, after measuring the body, customizing the clothes. The theme has been found. Well, Jia Zheng said, don't praise him yet, let's see how he does, and as a result, he came up with a long poem. We know what Bai Zhi, 9th century CE, has written, right? Song of Everlasting Sorrow and The Song of the Pipa are all old-style poetry, right? The choice of old-style poetry or strict form isn't random. So, Jia Baoyu is an old hand at poetry, that's what it means, he's really good at poetry. When we learn about an artistic tradition, we're actually understanding the different rules and styles that have developed within that tradition. Just because we break free from all constraints, it doesn't mean we can dance however we want. It's like taking off handcuffs. Just because they're off, doesn't mean you can start dancing freely, right? That's why we shouldn't see the forms of artistic works as something holding us back. If we keep using these forms, they actually represent the strength of the past that still lives on. So, what did it help artists to get past? It's the idea of having total freedom, so they can focus on creating something specific right away. That's why Stravinsky said, "When I hear the voice that calls me to create, my first reaction is fear. Then, I use the idea of being part of creation but not totally owned by it, to build my confidence." Having some strict rules actually makes our creations better. So, this thing that takes part in creation but isn't fully a part of it, what does that mean? It's talking about tradition. Tradition doesn't totally belong to what's being created, but it still takes part in it. So, tradition becomes our weapon to boost our confidence. It's really inspiring. Sometimes, we think the more choices and freedom we have, the better. But actually, with unlimited freedom, we can feel lost. I use this idea to talk about the education system at universities, like Fudan University. You know how now we can switch majors after the first year before the second year starts? It's like, we've got so much freedom now. Back in the day, once you picked a major, that was it for 4 years. Remember how you couldn't stand your major? You wanted to study something else but didn't get the grades, so they stuck you in the materials science department, so dull. And then for the next 4 years, it's all materials mechanics and these weird courses. What did you really want to study? Literature, right? Or maybe finance. Long story short, materials mechanics was the worst for me, but I was just gunning to get into Fudan University. So, in the end, you agreed to go along with it, but then they put you in materials mechanics. But now we've got flexibility. We can switch majors now. Is that a good or bad thing? I think it's not so great. It's like having too many choices. Unlimited freedom just gets us stuck in a rut, and bam, first year's already over. Back then, there was no switching majors. Just stick with materials mechanics for 4 years and do whatever after graduation, they said. But learning materials mechanics is just a vessel. What did you really get out of it? Growth. Academic cultivation. Have you ever struggled through tough material mechanics problems and ended up writing what? Yep, a bachelor's thesis. Even if you absolutely loathed it, the reality is that any solid higher education, no matter the major, will definitely give you what? Essential academic know-how and help develop that scholarly mindset and attitude, even in a subject you're not crazy about. Here's the deal nowadays. Most grads end up working in a field unrelated to their major, right? But let's not just think of higher education as a stepping stone to a future job. A proper and top-notch higher education is actually an education in itself. It's got one goal. It's not just prepping you for grad school or a future job, so what's it all about? Shaping the way we think, training our thinking, and giving us the experience and courage to seek out the truth. That's what higher education is all about. After I got my bachelor's degree in my major, I worked as an editor for 5 years before going back to philosophy. Our philosophy majors. Only 2 of us in our class stayed on in that field. The rest of the class went on to something else. But those 4 years studying philosophy weren't a waste, were they? It really brought to light an issue. In this day and age, everyone craves this kind of boundless freedom. It's all a bit abstract. The same goes for art creation, which is why what Stravinsky said is spot on. Too much freedom can make us feel scared and miserable. We've talked about how tradition and innovation rely on each other. Innovation can't exist without tradition, and tradition needs innovation to keep going. Each time artists come up with something new, it breathes life back into tradition. It's the artist's fresh ideas that keep tradition alive. But what happens if tradition and innovation are split up? The art form dies. What's left is something called intangible cultural heritage. Let me tell you about Peking Opera. It's like the OG of Chinese opera, you know what I mean? It's our national treasure. So, to keep Peking Opera lit and kicking in the art scene today, what's the key? Innovation, my friend. But hey, don't get it twisted. Innovating doesn't mean Peking Opera goes away. It's still holding it down. You've heard about revolutionary-style operas, right? Yeah, the modern revolutionary Peking Opera. Nowadays, there's some shade being thrown at these operas, which I think isn't cool. Ever heard of Taking Tiger Mountain by Clever Strategy, The Red Lantern, or Shajiabang? Harbor was another such styled opera. These operas were packed with political drama, and let's be real, we might not vibe with that these days. They were all about heroic figures in a political context, which is a whole other story. Our squad's love for Peking Opera is tied up with the modern revolutionary Peking Opera. So, what's the deal with these modern ones? They're keeping the traditional flavor alive by mixing in some fresh vibes. That's a major win because people still dig the tunes from these modern Peking operas. Honestly, when I'm asked to check out traditional Peking opera, I'm not feeling it. But hey, the die-hard fans, they're all about those classic arias. However, what's really keeping Peking opera popping is the modern revolutionary Peking opera. This example really nails the point, showing how tradition and innovation go hand in hand. If a cultural or artistic form wants to stay in the game, it's gotta keep bringing in fresh ideas while respecting its roots. Now, what's the deal with the future of Kunqu Opera? Some say it's super classy, but honestly, it's not my thing. I mean, those songs just go on and on. If you're gonna sing for eternity, I'll just chill and wait it out. But who's got the time for that? Times have changed, and Kunqu Opera's gotta find a way to keep its charm alive in a new, innovative style. Otherwise, it's history. No matter how hard we try to dress it up, it's no good, right? It's gotta keep its mojo in our modern world by mixing tradition with some fresh moves. And that's what we mean when we talk about tradition and innovation.